Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
Just a parish announcement before we kick off this episode. We were very pleased to hit 100 members of our Patreon just the other day. That's where we have bonus content where you can listen to the podcast ad-free, and also just a really helpful way of supporting the podcast, of keeping us going. To mark the occasion, we're going to do a little mini competition where over the course of the next week, so between the day this episode goes out and sundown on Sunday the 16th of August, for people who are already in the Patreon or who join within the next week, we'll do a little competition where we pick somebody at random and we'll send them signed copies of the most recent books that Richard and I have brought out. In my case, Coronations and Defenestrations, which we've spoken about very recently.
And keeping the red flag flying, the Labour Party in opposition since 1922. My history with Mark Garnett and Gavin Hyman of every period that Labour has been in opposition since it first assumed the title of official opposition back in 1922.
So we'll draw that next Sunday, and everybody who at that point is a member of the Patreon will be included. There's a link to it in the show notes.
So in today's episode, I'm going to be asking Lee about some research that he's done recently on a conservative politician for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Both Lee and I have been asked to submit entries on recently departed politicians. Last week, we talked about my subject, Anne Clwyd, the Welsh Labour MP. We're now moving across the home nations to Scotland to look at James Douglas Hamilton, Baron Selkirk of Douglas, who was a Conservative politician in Scotland and served in the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the Scottish Parliament. So, Lee, for those listeners who perhaps may have never heard of James Douglas Hamilton, or certainly don't know a great deal about him, perhaps you can kick us off by first telling us why you chose to write about him for the Oxford Dictionary National Biography.
Well, I think writing these DNB entries is quite a challenge because you're trying to capture the essence and also the factual reality of somebody's life, sometimes in as little as 1,000 words. So it's very difficult to really do that. So if I think about what were the themes which unavoidably come out of James Douglas Hamilton's life, one of them is that he's very much a feature of the aristocracy. So his father was the Duke of Hamilton and his maternal family were the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. So he was very much steeped in British aristocracy, which doesn't necessarily mean he deserves a biography in and of itself, but it's a notable element of his life. And it did mean, for example, that he was a page at the coronation of Elizabeth II. So it throws up lots of kind of fascinating curiosities about his life. For me, the most interesting thing, and what really earns him his place in the DNB, is that he served in 3 legislative chambers throughout the course of his career in politics. He was an MP, the MP for Edinburgh West from 1974 till 1997. He was a member of the House of Lords. He was very nearly a member of the House of Lords in 1994, which we'll come on to discuss. But he did become a member of the Lords. He became a peer, Baron Selkirk of Douglas, in 1997, and as is the case, remained there for the rest of his life. But he was also a member of the Scottish Parliament, the new Scottish Parliament, or the reconvened Scottish Parliament that came into effect in 1999, and he served there for the first 2 terms of the Parliament. And throughout that career, and this is maybe the third theme which we'll talk about, he was a type of political persona who was once plentiful in this country, but is now actually quite rare. In some ways, people would see them as being a bit of a throwback to how politics used to be done and the class and the type of views and the type of people who used to dominate politics. But actually, and as I hope listeners will come to see, he's a sort of person who we could probably do with a few more of in politics. You can't have a complete political class of James Douglas Hamiltons, I would probably say, but they're a very healthy component of British politics and have been for a very long time.
Yeah, so I can see in this that part of the attraction of James Douglas Hamilton to to your research interests is that he is both a small c and a big C conservative, and he's also what some people on the conservative side might call a good sort. He comes from the right pedigree, and it's not just the fact that he is an aristocrat that endears him, but maybe he carries with that some kind of, I don't know, broader sense of wider public interest by virtue of that, or at least that's the sort of old conservative idea here. When you and I went to Scotland earlier this year, Lee, and we went to Edinburgh and we met with some fans of our podcast, I remember one of the points of conversation, and really quite a wide ranging conversation that we had with them, was about the Scottish aristocracy and how, in some ways, Scotland is perhaps a more class driven society than England in some respects, or at least that Scotland has this kind of tradition of these grand old families that people might think are a peculiarly English institution, but actually there are some very grand and very old families in Scotland as well. And I would put James Douglas Hamilton's family, the Hamiltons, in one of the most venerable and oldest of those Scottish families. So can you give us a little bit of background on his family?
Yes, so his father was the 14th Duke of Hamilton, and that dukedom is the premier peerage in Scotland. So it comes with all these additional associations with, say, the royal family, with Holyrood Palace and different responsibilities that are part of this traditional aristocratic, regal life in Scotland over the centuries. His father was also a remarkable man in other respects, both in terms of his political involvement, but also in terms of his aviation achievements. He was the first person to fly over Everest, which he did in the early 1930s. One of Douglas Hamilton's books, he wrote 5 books in his life, was on the subject of his father's achievement and accomplishment in flying over Everest. But he was also involved in politics too, and knew, for example, Winston Churchill. And that connection to Churchill, and also probably that link to aviation as well, meant that he caught the eye of Rudolf Hess, a senior figure in the Nazi Party during the Second World War. And a remarkable story that happened in the war was that in 1941, Hess parachuted into Scotland, asked for the Duke of Hamilton, Douglas Hamilton's father, and basically said, "I know what Hitler's peace terms will be." Of course, that didn't work out. Hess was treated as a prisoner of war. He was subsequently convicted at Nuremberg and spent the rest of his life in prison until, somewhat quite remarkably, he committed suicide in the 1980s, in his 10th decade. But that came about because the Duke of Hamilton, his father, wasn't just some other aristocrat. He was a particularly accomplished and quite remarkable man. His childhood was spent in 2 rather grand houses. The first called Dungavel, which was a large house that he described as being on a lonely Lanarkshire moor. That was subsequently sold to the National Coal Board, as it happened, and then was later turned into a place to keep asylum seekers. And remarkably, when Douglas Hamilton was a minister in the Scotland office, he went to visit his former childhood home to see how it was fulfilling this new purpose. And he described how strange it was to see his old childhood bedroom, for example, turned into a holding cell for an asylum seeker. They later moved to a house called Lennox Love, which is described as being a remarkable and complicated mansion, one of the most significant and historically interesting houses of its type in Scotland, which is in East Lothian, and that's still the home of the Duke today. On his mother's side, as I mentioned, his grandmother and grandfather were the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, and his grandmother in particular was Lady of the Robes to the Queen Mother, and that's the reason that he ended up there at the coronation in 1953 in the role of a page.
James Douglas Hamilton is born during the Second World War in 1942, and he grows up in the post-war era at a time when Britain has elected a socialist majority government for the first time from 1945 to 51. There is this post-war consensus. Taxation's very high. Inheritance tax is being placed on big country houses that are being surrendered over to the National Trust and or sold off in various ways. Was his early life touched at all by the kind of democratic socialist revolution that Britain was ongoing, or was he able to pursue a relatively traditional upper class Scottish life in the 1940s and 50s?
From what I can tell of his educational background, he very much did follow quite the traditional path. So his father had gone to Eton and then Balliol College, Oxford. His elder brother, the one who inherited the dukedom, he went to Eton and then Balliol College, Oxford. And James himself, or Lord James, as he was referred to pretty much throughout his entire life, the honorary title he had as the son of a duke.
And we should say, when we hear Lord first name, surname, which is now sadly quite common in usage now. So let's say you were Lord, someone called you Lord Lee Evans. That's actually incorrect usage unless you're the son of a duke. It should be just the title and then surname, Lord Evans. But Lord James is appropriate here because he's a son of a duke. Just thought I'd throw that in there.
And for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not a lord at all, but he followed the same educational pattern as others in his family. One of the interests he clearly inherited from his father was a great love of boxing. And at both Eton and Oxford, he took up boxing enthusiastically, although not without perhaps the unavoidable, unless you're an extremely accomplished boxer. And it does seem he was decent. He fought for Eton 18 times and apparently came out on top in all but 4 of those bouts. But he did nevertheless, on occasions, have a broken nose. At one stage, he had a punctured lung. And what finally seems to have turned him off the sport, or forced his retirement from it, is that he tore the cartilage in both ends of a knee and required surgery. And they basically said, look, this is, if you want to be fit and healthy and walking at the age of 70 or 80, this is not what you want to be doing. Thankfully, whilst he was at Oxford, student politics provided an alternative vocation for him, and he basically achieved the double that many aspiring Tory politicians have sought to do at Oxford over the years. He was president of the University Conservative Association, and also after defeating Jonathan Aitken, another future Tory MP, who is, rather unfortunately for Aitken, most known for his perjury conviction these days. But after defeating Aitken to be secretary of the union, he became the Oxford Union's president as well. So he seems to have had this quite accomplished time, really, as a student. When he writes about his life at Oxford, he doesn't focus really much at all on the academic side of things, but really about the extracurricular stuff, at which he achieved great success. And it was during this time, in fact, when he was a student, that he went on a trip to Berlin alongside other students from other universities who were interested in what was going on in Europe, and particularly in post-war Germany and Berlin most particularly. And he wrote about it many years later. And he talks about how he was there with Donald Dewar and Michael Howard, and they were taken to the central square in West Berlin. He wrote, I was standing about 100 feet away from the dais, which was erected in front of the city hall, when a young sunburnt man full of charisma and vitality emerged. It was, of course, President Kennedy, and he was there in the crowd for the Ich bin ein Berliner speech that Kennedy gave in Berlin. So what I take from his youthful years really is that he had a very privileged experience at Eton and at Oxford. He was clearly popular. Things like the positions he won in the Oxford Union don't just happen by chance, they're elected positions. And he was also somebody who took a great interest in not just the parochial world of aristocratic Scotland or Eton or Oxford, but also in what was going on more broadly in the world around him.
But so far, this story of his education sounds quite English, to have gone to both Eton and then Oxford. And yet at the start of this episode, I said that he was seemingly a thoroughly Scottish character. So how does he make his return to Scotland?
Yeah, so you're right, he does have this thoroughly English education, but the remainder of his life, just like the early parts of it, are fully anchored in Scotland, even if they include lengthy stints of service in the Westminster Parliament. So after Oxford, he goes to the University of Edinburgh. He does 4 years' worth of legal training, and he's admitted to the Scottish Bar as an advocate. If that term sounds unusual to some listeners, of course, Scotland had and still has a separate legal system to England and Wales, and so other terms like advocate are used in place of barrister. But he was involved in Scottish law for about 6 years, and in this mix of people, which was actually extraordinary, especially actually people who were practicing law, who would go on to have careers in Scottish politics. So among the people who we got to know at this time was John Smith, the future leader of the Labour Party and Shadow Chancellor, Ming Campbell, who would go on to lead the Liberal Democrats, two future Foreign Secretaries, Robin Cook, who would be a Labour Foreign Secretary, and also Malcolm Rifkind, who would be a Conservative Foreign Secretary. Rifkind became a lifelong friend of Douglas Hamilton's, by all accounts, and in fact was his closest friend when he was at Edinburgh. And one of the things which you could say when you look at the context and the company that he was keeping at the time is that compared to a lot of the people who he knew and who he worked with who went into politics, Douglas Hamilton's own later achievements can look rather modest. But certainly in 1970s Edinburgh, he was very much in the mix of ambitious, aspiring politicians. And in 1972, he did what many of them did. He got a seat on Edinburgh City Council. He won that seat in a by-election. But already, rather than just seeing that as a vocation on the side, it looks like he had an eye on election to the House of Commons.
So he gets elected to Edinburgh City Council in 1972. This is, of course, during the Conservative government of Edward Heath down in Westminster. And Heath calls a snap election in February of 1974, which the Conservatives suddenly lose. And when you have a snap election, I think that can go two ways for the aspiring young politician. For some, it means it catches them off guard. They've not got their ducks in a line and the opportunity passes them by. For others, because of its suddenness and because of sort of a scramble sometimes to find candidates to fill seats, there's an opportunity to break through, to come out of nowhere. Does James Douglas Hamilton see that snap election in February of 1974 as an opportunity to strike, or does he let the opportunity pass him by?
Well, the early 1970s are a crucial period in his life in two key respects. He gets elected to Parliament and he gets married. So starting with the election to Parliament, snap elections bring opportunities, like you say, and when they're compounded with basically deadlocked elections and you have to go to the country again, 1974, the first year since 1910, when there were two general elections in the same year. We've not had a year like that since, thankfully. It also means that you get two bites of the cherry, potentially. So in the February 1974 election, he stands in the almost eponymous constituency of Hamilton, where he finishes third, but with a significantly increased Tory vote share. So the Conservatives had lost their deposit in that seat. The challenges around deposits, it's worth saying, were slightly tougher in the 1970s than they are today. So it's not quite as dire as it might seem. But nevertheless, the Conservatives had finished a poor third in 1970.
You needed 12.5% of the vote to get your deposit returned in those days. Today it's 5%.
Yeah, and what he manages to do is increase the Tory vote share by 9%, even at a time when the Conservatives are doing less well across the whole of the country. And seemingly it's both at the expense of the Labour Party and the SNP. Hamilton is a iconic seat in Scottish National Party history where he was standing. So both the SNP and Labour had prominence there, but both of them suffer a declining vote share and the Conservatives are up in the February election. When Harold Wilson and Ted Heath have a rematch in October, he's selected to fight the Edinburgh West constituency. But before we come on to that, we should think about one of the constituencies that he didn't get, which was, in fact, one of the best bits of Scotland to be a Tory in both then and now, which is part of Aberdeenshire, because he became aware that the Conservative candidacy in Aberdeenshire West was becoming vacant, and he went to see Lady Tweedsmuir, who was a former Aberdeenshire MP herself, and also the daughter-in-law of the author, the former MP, peer, and Governor-General of Canada, John Buchan. His aim really was to try and get the inside scoop on Tory or Unionist politics in Aberdeenshire, in the aim of getting invited to the selection panel and then having a chance of being selected as the candidate. He completely fails in that aim. He doesn't even get an interview. But he does get a soulmate as compensation. So he meets Lady Tweedmuir's daughter, Priscilla Susan Buchan, and they get married on the 24th of August, 1974. So wedged between these two elections, they get married. when that October election comes, he's in with a good chance of being returned to Parliament. So Edinburgh West has been Conservative or Unionist since 1931, and it remains so in the October election. So he's finally into Parliament.
So he gets elected to Parliament in October 1974. And Ted Heath is Conservative leader, but he's going to be on his way out and replaced by Margaret Thatcher in a few months' time. But what's notable about both Margaret Thatcher and Edward Heath is that they came from lower middle class backgrounds, grammar school educated, sort of the first in the Conservative Party of their class profile. And James Douglas Hamilton does not have that class profile. He is much more of the old conservative, blue-blooded, aristocratic type. He is, after all, as we've said, the son of a duke. So does he arrive into Parliament and find himself a bit of a square peg in a round hole? Or is there still a sufficient kind of culture of the old conservative aristocracy that he fits in well? I mean, in other words, to what extent is there a bit of a social revolution going on in the Conservative Party that he's on the wrong side of when he enters Parliament in the 1970s?
Certainly by the end of his time in politics, I think that would look like it was the case, that he was out of kilter with what was an increasingly meritocratic and socially diverse Conservative parliamentary party. But I don't think he stood out in the 1970s when he was elected, or throughout the 1980s or into the 90s either. I think if we think about what his politics were, from what I can conclude from what I've read about him and the people I've spoken to about him, he was a pragmatic, pretty practical Tory who thought things through, was diligent, and was loyal. So he was not by instinct the sort of person who would cause issues for a Tory leader, irrespective really of their background. So whilst it might have been the case that had he been in Parliament when Alec Douglas-Home was party leader, he might have felt a little bit more familiar in Douglas-Home's company. I don't think he struggled necessarily in Heath's or Thatcher's. He made his maiden speech after getting elected on a debate about the death penalty, and in particular the death penalty for terrorists. And he opposed it, and he opposed bringing it back, basically on the grounds that he thought it was actually be counterproductive. And the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins at the time, of course a Labour Home Secretary, praised his speech as being brave and lucid. Now, in politics, it can be quite a dangerous thing to get lots of praise from your opponents. But thankfully, he was also recognised by people on his own side for his abilities. And in 1977, he was appointed the whip for the Scottish Conservative MPs. And I mentioned his instinctive loyalty. So I think it was a very good choice to be a whip. But the mid-late 1970s was actually quite a perilous time, because one of the issues that was really salient in British politics at the time was the prospect of devolution, and in particular the Scotland and Wales bill that the Callaghan government was bringing in, which included plans for devolution. Now, it's worth saying that previously the Conservative policy was in favour of devolution, and technically at this stage as well the policy was in favour of devolution. But Margaret Thatcher argued not devolution as proposed by Jim Callaghan, and she whipped Conservative MPs to vote against the bill at second reading. This did provoke a rebellion from Scottish Tory MPs. The Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland resigned from the Shadow Cabinet. Malcolm Rifkind, who I mentioned earlier, was a close associate and friend of Douglas Hamilton's, and was very much an up-and-coming MP. He also resigned, and Douglas Hamilton broke the whip, from what I can tell is the only time in his career as an MP, and abstained on the second reading, in spite of a 3-line whip to vote against.
So just to be clear, he breaks the whip in 1976, the end of 1976, and then a few months later, he's made a whip for the Scottish Tory MPs. That was his designation, his responsibility as a whip. Do you think the fact that he was a Scottish MP gave him a bit of a pass on that? And normally, I think leaders don't look too favourably on whip breakers, particularly 3-line whip breakers. And certainly, I think it's quite unusual for them to rush to make an MP a whip themselves after defying the whip only a few months earlier. But perhaps Margaret Thatcher saw either something greater in Douglas Hamilton, or perhaps understood just the uniqueness of that particular issue for a Scottish MP?
Well, I think she did see that issue as being a bit different for the Scottish Tory MPs as a cohort rather than just individually. And she went to great lengths to write to them all to basically say, look, the policy is still pro-devolution, but we're just opposed to this bill. Of course, she would then be Prime Minister for 11 and a half years and not make plans for devolution. So I think it was actually something she was probably opposed to. And from the evidence I've seen, the more she studied the bill and the more she thought about it, the less inclined she was to back Scottish devolution, or Welsh devolution for that matter. But I think what's actually even more important about why she makes this conciliatory move of bringing him into the whip's office quite early on is that Labour is also divided, in many ways much more deeply divided over the question of Scottish devolution than the Conservatives are. And so if you can smooth over the discord within the Tory party, so you can keep prodding at the open wounds that remain on the Labour benches. If you think about people like Tam Dael and others who are making their critiques and speaking about the West Lothian question, it's in these debates that the idea of the West Lothian question is spoken about and developed. So it helped bring the Tory party back together. And I could see no sense that Douglas Hamilton was keener to sulk on the back benches than actually just roll his sleeves up and get involved as a whip.
And we're going to do an episode later this year about the devolution referendum in Scotland. We're going to interview our friend of the podcast, Tom Chidwick, who has a forthcoming book called Now or Never, which is a book about the history of the 1970s debates in Scotland over devolution. So we can unpack those differences in that episode. What's interesting to me then, looking ahead from 1977, when James Douglas Hamilton is given this responsibility as a Conservative whip, is that for much of the rest of his time in the House of Commons, he's serving on the front benches, and for most of that time, he is serving on the front benches with a special responsibility for Scotland. And so, Lee, can you tell us a little bit about his front bench career and that focus on Scotland in particular? I would say that when I've researched and written about Labour MPs who have been given sometimes responsibility for their home nation, if they're a Scottish MP or a Welsh MP, they sometimes get a little resentful of that pigeonholing for that particular part of the United Kingdom. So I know Judith Hart, who was a Scottish Labour MP, although she was actually English, when she was given a Scotland office responsibility, she resented being left with responsibilities for Scotland. And even Anne Clwyd, who we talked about last week, she was very briefly Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Wales. And although she was very passionate about her Welsh identity, it seems to be the ministry or shadow ministry that she was least enthused about having. So what's the story for James Douglas Hamilton?
So on that big question, you're right that his ministerial or front bench service is almost wholly Scottish focused. There are exceptions to that rule. He continues in the whip's office and has some broader activities and responsibilities in between 1979 and 1981. And there's a time after the 1983 election when he's PPS, Parliamentary Private Secretary, to a Minister of State at the Foreign Office. But that Minister of State is Malcolm Rifkind, who of course is his old friend from Scotland. And he follows Malcolm Rifkind then into the Scotland office when Rifkind becomes Secretary of State for Scotland. And then for the last decade, really, of his political life, his responsibilities are Scottish. I get no sense that he resented that. I think he cared very greatly about Scotland and saw himself inherently and unavoidably and willfully as a Scottish figure and a Scottish politician. But there were times when his brief could roam a little bit more broadly. And he writes in his memoir about some of the experiences that he had, for example, when he was in the whip's office in those early years. In particular, he writes about a time when the chief whip asked him whether he would join a Labour whip as representatives of the House of Commons to the St. Lucia and the Dominica independence celebrations that were taking place in the Caribbean. And the whole trip, which I'm sure was very lovely, very beautiful parts of the world to visit, seems to have basically been a bit of a farce. Not because of anything that he did, but because of the well, at least in part, the incompetence of the House of Commons authorities back home. So the president of the St. Lucia Parliament said to him that it would be a great help if the Lord Chancellor back home, which happened to be Lord Hailsham at the time, could send him a spare gown so that he could act in a way that was, quote, commensurate with the dignity of his office. So Douglas Hamilton got back to Lord Hailsham and asked him about this, and Hailsham's response was, quote, a naked man had swum across the Thames and had managed to enter the Lord Chamberlain's lodgings, where he covered himself in his lordship's spare gown. The person concerned was assisted out of the lodgings when he was discovered, but by that time the spare gown was regrettably no longer in a usable condition for anyone. Now, if anyone's got evidence of that actually happened, I would be staggered. That half sounds to me like Hailsham has sat there and thought, what is the most extraordinarily unbelievable reason I could give for not giving over this spare gown to the President of the Parliament of St. Lucia? I looked in newspaper archives, I've looked elsewhere for that. Unless I'm forgetting something, I don't know that that's been recorded elsewhere, but that was apparently the excuse that was given. Later on in the trip, they go to Dominica, where the gift that is then being given to the newly independent country is a chair for the new Speaker of their Parliament. But he's also finding it difficult to be good to their hosts, because it turns out that in an attempt to save money, the parliamentary authorities decided not to fly the chair to Dominica, but to send it by a freight ship via the St. Lawrence River in Canada, which they thought would be the cheapest way of getting it there. But unfortunately, the river had iced up. The chair then had to be rescued from the frozen vessel and eventually flown down to Dominica, but it didn't make it there in time for the ceremony. The Prime Minister decided, nevertheless, that they should go ahead and just do a symbolic presentation of what would be the chair as and when it arrived. But the Prime Minister of Dominica asked about the actual gift from the British government. The chair was from the House of Commons, but there was due to be a gift also from the British government. Douglas Hamilton says he still has no idea what that gift actually was meant to be, because that too had not reached Dominica and was apparently stolen in transit. And all the Foreign Office would say is that the gift went astray. So those sort of two little anecdotes taken from his memoirs give a bit of a sense, I think, that it wasn't just a parliamentary career that was focused on relief roads around Edinburgh or housing policy in Scotland and things like that. It did have lots of other colour and lots of interest around the world as well. Those two being particularly fortunate events. But nevertheless, his career was very, very Scottish focused. And one thing I think it's just really worth saying about that Scottish focus is that we have to try and put ourselves into the mindset of pre-devolution Scotland. So it's sometimes tempting, I think, particularly for people whose, we're both in this category, I guess, whose own living memory of politics is only post the new Scottish Parliament and devolution in Scotland. It's sometimes easy to perhaps imagine that UK politics beforehand was a bit of a one-size-fits-all political system, but it really wasn't. There were ministers in the Scotland office, there were Scottish-only bills that were passed in Parliament. Of course, as I mentioned before, Scotland has its own legal system, which was reflected in politics as well. And so when Douglas Hamilton went in 1987 and became a Minister of State in the Scotland office, he actually had a huge amount of power and authority, really. There had been cooperation and collaboration with other ministers and MPs from Scotland as well, over how Scotland was governed. So I don't think it was a case of he found his career was held back and he didn't necessarily get to the positions or the power that he really would have wanted. He actually had a great many competencies in Scottish politics.
And I think it's just noting and reflecting here for a moment that James Douglas Hamilton was in government for 16 years, either as a minister or the PPS to a minister or a government whip. The Conservatives were in government for 18 years, sadly, from 1979 to 1997, or at least I'd say sadly. And it was only just for 2 of those years that his situation was firmly on the back benches from 1981 to 1983. And given the circulation of ministers today, given the brevity of political lives today, I think that is worth in itself just noting and reflecting on and thinking about. As you said, he basically spent a decade in just one ministry in the Scotland office from the late 80s until the late 90s. And do you think at that time it was recognized as important in having some ministers who had staying power, not because they were flashy, not because they were sort of celebrities in their own right, but because they were seen as competent, good sorts? And do you think we're missing any of that in our politics today?
Well, there's a lot to be said, I think, for some consistency in ministerial office. And there's also a lot to be said for conscientious MPs who aren't always necessarily chasing the next promotion or thinking about how can they. There was no social media in his days, but what's the next best social media video they can put out to get a number of likes? Where I don't want to say everybody who does that is quite shallow about it, but there's a certain shallowness, I think, that's entered into politics now, which I don't think people would have accused him of in terms of the work and the seriousness with which he approached issues as a minister, partly because sometimes he was focusing on not particularly glamorous issues, but where he thought there was an issue that needed to be solved. So he did work about the status of children in divorce cases, for example, and changing the law in Scotland around that. Not things that were necessarily going to capture the public attention and win him lots of plaudits, but it was kind of diligent work. In terms of how people saw him in the department and how other MPs thought about him, I mean, he was apparently known in the Scotland office as the gent, and people saw him as basically being part of that class of old school politicians who were very courteous and very gentlemanly in how they went about their business. A Labour MP, Bob Hughes, once described being attacked in a partisan way by Douglas Hamilton as being up against somebody who floated like a bee and stung like a butterfly, which was the opposite, seemingly, of how he was in the boxing ring in his youth when he was clearly quite accomplished at it. And this meant that people actually liked and respected him, I think, a great deal. It did occasionally cause him the odd issue. So if there's ever a story that's said about Douglas Hamilton, it's usually about his relationship with a woman driver when he was a minister. So he had a ministerial car that was part of the government service, and his driver was a woman. But it said that chivalric obligations meant that he always wanted to open the car door for her rather than have the car door open for him. So as soon as the car pulled up somewhere, he would jump out of the car so he could open the door for his driver. And from one account that I read of it, one of the whips got word of the fact that this driver wanted to be moved onto another minister because he thought this was professionally embarrassing. I've not been able to verify that, but that's sort of what's suggested. And apparently the whip thought, oh my gosh, when you get told that there's a Tory minister who's causing upset to a female driver, you almost assume the worst. The whip was no doubt incredibly relieved when they heard the reason for it. And I don't know whether he relented and allowed the door to be opened for him. But these were the sorts of things that people would say about Douglas Hamilton. Definitely a figure who, when he was practicing politics and afterwards, was spoken about with tremendous affection.
He almost sounds like to me like a hereditary peer. And when you sort of said that kind of quiet reserve but courteousness, that public spirited mentality, and also that championing of friendless causes, I was actually thinking of one of my favourite hereditary peers who's just been ejected from Parliament unceremoniously by Keir Starmer, the Lord Attlee, the Earl Attlee, who comes from a much shorter line of earls than Douglas Hamilton being the son of the 14th Duke of Hamilton. But I always thought in the Earl Attlee that he was someone who knew that he had his position in life by the luck of being the grandson of a prime minister, but thought, well, I'm going to use this role to do something to serve my country and the people in my country, and in Attlee's case, to focus on a group that was much neglected, which was young men in the prison in the prison system, and looking at rehabilitation there. So I just mentioned that. But the funny thing, of course, about James Douglas Hamilton is that he's not a hereditary peer, at least at this point. He's an elected member of parliament, and he represents a highly marginal constituency. So what's the explanation for his electoral survival in Edinburgh?
Well, I mentioned earlier that Edinburgh West had been a Tory seat for a very long time, but in 1983 we get these very dramatic boundary changes across the UK, and it carves up his seat in new and really quite unwelcome ways for Douglas Hamilton. And so the majority that he won in 1979, which was just under 7,500, was slashed in 1983 to 498, and that's in the wider context of the Conservatives winning a landslide victory across the country. So he was left with the smallest majority in Scotland, so electorally incredibly precarious. But he managed to keep on winning until the ultimate Tory blowout of 1997. But his majority was never anything that he could be complacent about. But he had a very good reputation, I think, for caring and engaging in local issues, for using the platform that he had on the front bench to, when he could, to try and advance local issues. Now, you mentioned that brief period of time when he wasn't on the front bench. That's from 1981 to 83. Arguably, in that sense, given that the 83 election was his smallest majority ever, arguably a virtue, because as a whip, he wouldn't have had the same freedom to speak in the Commons that he did have as just a mere backbencher. So that was in some ways quite helpful for him. But also what he had to his advantage was some of the things that his opponents would say about him. So in 1986, a Labour MP said in the House of Commons, it's there in Hansard, that he was a powerful member of Parliament in terms of how he stood up for his constituency. At the time, I think they're talking about airports in Edinburgh. And he uses this praise on his own leaflets and says, look, even the Labour MPs basically are praising the work I do locally. But when the Tory defeat came in 97, which left them with no Conservative MPs at all north of the border, that was an electoral tidal wave that not even Douglas Hamilton's highly effective campaigning over the last few decades could resist.
And actually, James Douglas Hamilton might have exited the House of Commons even earlier, not as a result of the verdict of his voters, but because of the hereditary peerage system. So we've said that he is the son of a duke, but he's the younger son of the duke, so he's not expecting to become the 15th Duke of Hamilton. That's going to go to his older brother. But there's another position coming down the line that could potentially throw his House of Commons career into jeopardy. So what's all that?
Yes, it's one of the perils, but also the privileges, of course, of being a family so connected to the aristocracy. And particularly at this time, this is before 1999 House of Lords reform, where hereditary peers are actually peers. They're members of the House of Lords rather than just people with titles. And in 1994, his uncle, the Earl of Selkirk, dies. This is a man called George, or seemingly known as Geordie Douglas Hamilton. Now, James Douglas Hamilton had known for quite a long time that he was probably the heir to this title. It's a peerage that has a very complicated system of remainder. It does subsequently lead to a case where another member of the family challenges Douglas Hamilton's right to have the earldom. But by the time he's confirmed as the rightful earl, it's a bit of a moot point, really, from Douglas Hamilton's perspective, because inheriting a peerage at this time, and listeners who were with us way back when we discussed Tony Benn's fight to disclaim a peerage in the early 1960s will remember, inheriting a peerage at the time immediately disqualified you from the House of Commons. And under the Peerages Act 1963, there was a window of a few weeks, about 4 weeks, in which you could surrender that title and remain in the House of Commons, or if not, you were rejected and there'd be a by-election in your seat. Now, of course, it's a highly marginal constituency, as we've discussed. This is the mid-1990s. This is not a great time for the Conservatives. The Conservative majority is razor thin by that stage. By the end of the Parliament, the Conservatives basically wouldn't have a majority. Nobody else would either, but, the Conservative majority was pretty perilous. And so there was very quickly pressure on him. I don't think sort of thumb screws, intense pressure, but there was sort of moral pressure to sort of do the decent thing for the government. And so the then Secretary of State for Scotland, Ian Lang, wrote to him to warn that the government's majority was at risk in an upcoming vote and that it would be treated as a confidence vote. And they asked him to, as soon as possible, disclaim the peerage to stay as an MP to enable him to vote, because in this period between his uncle dying and the Act of Disclaimer, he wasn't entitled to sit as an MP. It was assumed that he was a peer. Douglas Hamilton himself wanted to be a bit slow about it. He thought it would be needlessly hasty to disclaim the title until after his uncle's funeral, but the pressure of this letter and the forthcoming vote, which as it happens the government won very comfortably, persuaded him to put in the Act of Disclaimer very quickly, and so in the end he was only an earl for just 4 days.
And I suppose, having been a Conservative whip in that hung Parliament of the late 1970s, when every vote counted, he probably had a bit of a muscle memory from that time in thinking, gosh, I don't want to be the one Conservative vote that costs us that policy. I mean, you have to remember, Jim Callaghan passed major legislation, sometimes by majority of one. You know, shipbuilding was nationalised in this country on a majority of one. The government fell on a majority of one. Margaret Thatcher brought down the Callaghan government on a majority of one. So I can understand that as a former whip, the risk of being the one that harmed your government probably was enough to outweigh his more gentlemanly senses when it came to his uncle's funeral.
I think that's right, and it did give him a unique place in history. So he was the last MP to ever disclaim a hereditary peerage, because the need to do so, to remain in the Commons, went with the House of Lords reforms at the end of the decade, the ones that Tony Blair brought in that removed most of the hereditaries from the House of Lords. So it's a relatively short and very interesting period in British history where it was possible and necessary for some people to give up their peerages. He did get compensation for it, though, in two forms, really. In 1996, he was made a Privy Councillor, so he became a Right Honourable. It wasn't necessarily connected to the giving up of the peerage, but sometimes when it's written about, it's seen as being a bit of a thank you, both for his long-standing service, including as a minister, but also for doing the decent thing over the earldom.
It's a bit like Anne Clwyd being made a Privy Councillor the year after she votes for the Iraq invasion.
Well, I think this is more noble than that, but nevertheless, and when he goes to Buckingham Palace to be made a Privy Councillor, the two of the other people who are being admitted to the Privy Council at the same time are Gordon Brown and Robin Cook. And although they would both go on to hold great offices of state just a few years afterwards, at the time, Douglas Hamilton was the only one of them to have a government car. So he offered them both lifts back to the House of Commons after they'd all become the Right Honourable together. And also after 1997, he got a second piece of compensation when John Major contacted him and said, "Would you accept a peerage in my resignation honours?" Major making the point that there was an exceptional case to be made for Douglas Hamilton to join the Lords. It's quite an interesting thing, John Major's resignation honours, because it's an incredibly long list, including an incredibly long list of peers. But most of those peers are Labour peers, because basically two honours lists get rolled into one, from what I can tell. And you get the ones that John Major wants to make them because they're people he wants to recognise and thank for their service. And there are 10 peers who are on that list. But then there's also a very long list of Labour peers as well. And there's also 5 more Tory peers who are all categorised as working peers. And that's partly because, of course, by the time Major's resignation list is out, Tony Blair is Prime Minister, Lord's reform is coming, but not yet done. And there's a desire both to staff the government, but also to try and rebalance the House of Lords somewhat to create more Labour peers. So it's part of this much longer list, but there's only really 10 peers where I think you can say they are from John Major as the outgoing PM, and Douglas Hamilton is one of them.
I should say at this time there are well over 1,000 members of the House of Lords, and when people today complain, in my view, completely unnecessarily about the number of peers there are, number of members there are in the House of Lords, it pales in comparison to the number of members that were there back in the 1990s. But the sky didn't fall in when there were over 1,000 Lords, and I say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's have more peers, not fewer.
But this is an example as well, actually, of doing the decent thing paying off, because had he accepted the earldom, then he could have been kicked out of the Lords in 1999. Certainly, he would have had to stand for election to be one of the remaining Conservative peers at that point. But because he was given a life peerage, that was his for the remainder of his life.
That's a very good point. So I think he's sort of at an awkward time in life, really, if you think about it. So he's in his mid-50s. I think he's about 55 at this point in 1997. He'd been an MP for 23 years. And at that age, I suppose you could sort of take an early retirement. He certainly was someone of comfortable means and money wouldn't have been an issue. He could have taken the life peerage and sort of had a quasi-active life in the House of Lords. But the curious thing about now Lord Selkirk is he embarks on a completely new political life and actually has really quite a active and different uh, life after leaving the House of Commons, but still very active in politics. So tell us a little bit about that, Lee.
There are a few important points to make, I think. One of them is that he was a man with a hinterland. He had lots of charitable associations throughout his life, and that he maintained some of them to the end of his life. He also had a long-standing association with the reserve forces as well, which dated right back to his time at Eton and at Oxford, and then carried on again throughout much of his life. So he did have a bit of a hinterland. Whilst politics, it strikes me as the great vocation of his life, he did have other things that he did as well. But it strikes me that he felt a bit of a quiet thrill, perhaps. I don't know how he voted in the devolution referendum in 1997. I'd love to know. But he doesn't write about that in his memoirs, and I've not seen that elsewhere. The Conservative position, of course, was opposed to it. But it does seem like he felt a bit of a thrill, really, at the Scottish Parliament being reconvened, to use the term that was used at the time, and his chance to play a part in it. So he decides that when the new Scottish Parliament is created, that he will put himself forward to be a Conservative candidate for it. He's a little concerned that although he's not especially old, like you say, he's in his mid-late 50s by this stage, he's a little concerned that for a new Parliament, the Scottish Tories might want a new generation of politicians, but he makes the case to them. Quote, "We have within our ranks a combination of youth and enthusiasm, wisdom and experience, and there is a place for them all." And while people find that argument compelling enough to say that he should be a candidate, he stands in Edinburgh West, the constituency he had represented, which doesn't send him to Holyrood, but he's second on the list for the Lothians. So the Scottish Parliament isn't first past the post, of course, like the House of Commons. There's constituency MSPs, and there's also people from a top-up list. He uses the additional member system. And he's second on the list in the Lothians, and because the Conservatives don't win many constituencies, he's elected in that capacity. This severance from a constituency seems to give him the chance to pursue some, what you could see as being a little bit more idiosyncratic issues, including he spends quite a bit of time trying to persuade Tony Blair through the Scottish Parliament to amend the Act of Settlement to remove discrimination against Catholics in the line of succession to the Crown. Quite an unusual thing to do in some respects, because Douglas Hamilton himself is a member of the Church of Scotland. It's not entirely clear whether or not at this stage it was the case, but I think quite possibly. Tony Blair is a secret Catholic. And after he leaves office, he converts to Catholicism. But it seems whilst he was Prime Minister, he was attending Catholic Church consistently, including when his Catholic wife, Cherie, wasn't. So you've got this Church of Scotland MSP trying to persuade a secretly Catholic MP and Prime Minister to change the law, but unsuccessfully. He continues his service in the Scottish Parliament on the front bench as well, so he's Chief Whip and Business Manager for the Scottish Conservative Group for the first 2 years of the Parliament. He also becomes spokesman on Home Affairs and Education, always in opposition. Of course, the Conservatives have never formed the administration or been part of the administration in Holyrood. And then he finally retires in 2007. But that's not the end of politics for him. He continues in the House of Lords. In fact, he makes his final speech in the House of Lords just 6 months before he died. He speaks in the summer of 2023 in support of the Hunting Trophies Import Prohibition Bill, which is to try and ban people from bringing, well, hunting trophies in effect. So if people have shot a lion or something in Africa, to stop them importing that back. And he also holds his other positions in Scottish public life as well. So he spends a year as Lord High Commissioner to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. So he doesn't shrink away from public life after 2007, and he does continue as a member of the House of Lords. But certainly by that stage, electoral politics, in which he's been remarkably successful throughout his career, is over for him.
So to wrap this up, Lee, I wonder if you could take a step back and reflect on Lord Selkirk's politics. Where did he sit within the Conservative Party? We haven't talked a great deal actually about his policy positions. We've reflected on his life of service and dedication in government and to the Conservative Party, and we've acknowledged that those are merits in of themselves. But in terms of his substantive politics, was he a Thatcherite? Was he an old wet? Was he One Nation? Was he a liberal? Does he defy any of these characterizations?
Well, he himself said that his politics were pragmatic rather than ideological. He says that in the context of hinting that he wasn't gung-ho for every aspect of the Thatcherite agenda that happened in the 1980s. But nevertheless, he was pragmatic about the political situation as it was, that she was prime minister and party leader with big majorities and the majority of the party behind her. And I think he saw the things that mattered to him. I think that tradition of public service, of decency, of doing something for community and nation and state as being effectively served by loyal service in government over all those years. I mean, I think it's hard. People who knew him and had private discussions with him will quite probably know better than I do, really what he thought in private. And I think you could try to pigeonhole him as an old school One Nation Tory in a sense. And maybe he would have thought of himself a little bit like that in terms of the pragmatism of his politics. We've obviously recently debated on this podcast about how the idea of One Nation has changed over the years. But much better to see him, I think, as a politician steeped in that tradition of public service than somebody who was ideologically fixated on being in any particular wing or faction of the party. And as I said at the very outset, you can't have entire parliamentary parties that are made up of James Douglas Hamiltons. But from all I've learned about him in this research, I think it's very, very healthy and a very good thing to have at least a few of them. And the general demise of that type of politician, they're much rarer than they once were, is a sad thing for our politics overall.
We finish this podcast in the way that we normally do by discussing the books that we've been reading recently. Lee, why don't you go first?
Well, if people do want to find out more about his life, you can read a memoir that James Douglas Hamilton wrote. He wrote a few books. He wrote books about Rudolf Hess and the misadventure that saw him parachuting into Scotland and trying to speak to his father. He wrote about his father's flight over Everest, and he also wrote this memoir himself in 2009 called After You, Prime Minister, which is a foreword by his old friend Sir Malcolm Rifkind. It would be uncharitable to say the book is a collection of anecdotes, although it has plenty of anecdotes and plenty of stories, rather than a great study of politics or his views. But it gives a very readable and very pleasant sense of his life and the things that mattered to him at particular times and what he hoped to contribute to politics during his time as an MP, an MSP, and also as a peer as well. So it's called After You, Prime Minister by James Douglas Hamilton. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, I've just finished a book called Stuck: How Money, Media and Violence Prevent Change in Congress by Maya Kornberg. So the premise of this book is that the US Congress is stuck. It's finding it harder and harder to pass meaningful legislation. That gridlock is destroying the American legislative process. And Kornberg identifies a few potential explanatory factors for that gridlock. She goes beyond the normal focus, I think, on pure partisanship and ideological polarization, about which there are already very many books, and instead picks up on these three factors of money, the media, and threats of violence against members to see the extent to which those have made things harder or worse in Congress. And she then charts this over three, what they call in America, classes of members of the House of Representatives. The Watergate babies, so called because they were elected in 1974 after the fall of Richard Nixon, mostly Democrats and reformers. The Gingrich Republican Revolution generation of 1994, and then the first blue wave of Democrats elected in 2018 after Donald Trump's election in 2016, when the Democrats did very well. And what she's looking for in those three waves of very big change in the House of Representatives is how easy or difficult did the new members find it to get their feet steadily on the ground and actually start to make a difference in the very short terms that exist in the US House of Representatives. Terms are just 2 years and, realistically speaking, really about 18 months before you have to go back and face the electorate. And so the thing I like about this book is that Kornberg has drawn very, very heavily from interviews with members and their senior staff. And so you get, I think, really as close as you can to a behind the curtains look at the operations of Congress. And you really get a feel of what it's like to get elected to Congress, to find yourself after a multi-million-dollar struggle, as it's now often becoming, to get into that chamber and then think, well, after spending all that money and all those hours and months of campaigning, I get here, and what can I do? Not a great deal. So it's not a happy book, I would say, but I think it's an important book, and it's a very informative and insightful book about a topic and problem we know a lot about, but from a slightly different angle.
Well, that's all for this episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. If you enjoyed the podcast as ever, we'd be really grateful if you left a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from. And just a reminder that over on the Patreon, there's 7 days to join before we draw the winner of our giveaway, when we'll send a signed copy of our most recent books on the Tory leadership and Labour in opposition to a random member of the Patreon. So we'll draw that next Sunday. Otherwise, we'll be back on Thursday with our next Matters of Interest episode. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.